We're in a period right now that gender scholars have called the stalled gender revolution. And what this means, if you look at all kinds of data, what you see is in the 1970s, we started to see a rapid closing in narrowing of gender inequality. So the gender wage gap, for example, starts to go down rapidly in the 1970s. More women are flooding into paid labor. Women are being promoted. You get to the 1980s, progress is still being made, although it's a little bit slower. And by the time we hit the mid-90s, change is kind of flattened out. Okay, so things aren't getting worse, but we haven't seen a lot of progress in the move towards gender equality lately. So we're a bit stuck. And my take on that is the reason that we're stuck is that we haven't effectively changed work enough to accommodate who's actually in our workplaces today. And that once we do that, we're going to see a jump start towards the move towards more gender equality. One thing that we know is stereotypes do limit women's advancement, but they do so not because people necessarily have explicit stereotypes about men versus women, but that they have more unconscious or implicit kind of associations about what men are like and what women are like. And those implicit associations then affect how we see someone's performance, how we judge their behavior, and can create sort of slight differences in the ways that we then evaluate men and women in the workplace. So these unconscious and explicit biases, I think, are one of the biggest barriers that we're still up against today when we think about how we can move more women into leadership. Often we have too narrow of a conception of leaders. Leaders are these, autocratic kind of, risk-taking sort of people, and our stereotypes about leaders overlap with our stereotypes about men, such that men often look naturally more leader-like to us. But if we broaden the stereotypes of leadership, that creates a more expansive view of leadership, and one in which women are likely to be seen as more successful. So if stereotypes are causing us to see some people as more talented than they are and other people as less talented than they are, it's interfering with the goal of being truly meritocratic and is blocking innovation. What ways can we introduce policies and procedures and tools into the workplace that cause people, once stereotypes creep into their head, to be aware of that and stop and move beyond the stereotype? So the goal is, rather than relying on some stereotype about how men and women are, we would instead have some sort of procedure in place that would allow us to more effectively evaluate the true talents and abilities of people, and therefore block the effects of bias on their judgments. We have to help people first see biases. So I do a lot of work with teaching people about the way that stereotypes work, because until you see how stereotypes work, you're not going to be aware of how it could be affecting your judgment. And I should just add, just to be clear here, is that these stereotypes affect all of our judgments, women as well as men's. We see that very clearly. You rarely find that a situation where men are a lot more biased than women. These are unconscious stereotypes. We have to help people see them first. So that seeing bias is kind of key. One of the things that's been really encouraging to me in this work is how many really well-intentioned people there are out there, men and women, who want to get beyond bias. So the question is, can we help them do that? So what I've been doing is working with a lot of different companies to help them create tools. And so we have some ideas about the kinds of things that work in general. So for example, we know that when people have clear criteria for, say, a promotion decision that's very clearly articulated, and they read and study that criteria before they evaluate job applicants, stereotypes are much less likely to affect their judgments. One thing that we notice that when people are making decisions is sometimes the criteria they use to judge people will shift around depending upon whether they're evaluating a woman or a man. So a great example that comes from psychology shows that when people were evaluating psychology faculty, they were way more likely to say, well, I would need to see if she was a good teacher before I could hire her. But that criteria hadn't been raised when they were evaluating a man. So it's a perfectly legitimate criteria, right? You would want a professor to be a good teacher, but it was being applied much more heavily to women than to men. So one of our tools is for someone in the group to be noticing when new criteria are being raised and to say something like, if we're going to consider teaching, I think we should go back and consider that for all of the candidates so that we're using the same criteria. That too blocks the use of stereotypes. So there's a variety of kinds of things like that that we can do to not eliminate the unconscious stereotypes that are happening in our head, but to block their negative effects and to be sure that we're evaluating people by criteria and not by stereotypes. Imagine a company wants to say, do better on its diversity and inclusion indicators, and the CEO comes out and says, this is one of our main priorities, and we're really going to work hard on this. And that's great. To have that kind of support from the top is essential. But what we find is that support from the top kind of trickles down, and it's affecting sort of managers at kind of higher levels. But once it gets to kind of the mid-level of the organization, it often gets stuck. So we've got this CEO supporting change at the top. You've got people at the bottom that are agitating for change. But you get to that middle level, and that's what we call the frozen middle. It's a place where organizational change often gets stuck, especially in diversity and inclusion. And so our goal in working on these projects is to really try to work at that frozen middle. That is to develop these tools to block bias by working directly with people managers. And by working directly with people managers, what we're hoping to do is enlisting them in the support of creating the tools helps create buy-in at that level where change otherwise gets stuck. There's something that's actually really quite easy to do, and that is we can share the accomplishments of other women in our networks at work. One thing that we know is that stereotypes cause women to be seen as less competent than they actually are, and that's what limits women's advancement. Women can't fix this problem themselves, right? You can't, as a woman, if people aren't noticing your accomplishments, you can't just say, I'm brilliant, for example. There'd be all kinds of backlash directed at you. But one thing that we can do is tout other women's accomplishments. So I think being very mindful of giving attention to the accomplishments of women in the organization is hugely important. So individuals can do this, organizations as well, I think, announcing through department newsletters and things like that the accomplishments of their women employees are crucially important for raising those women's status and for starting to fracture the stereotypes that we have that are leading us to cause us to see women as less competent than they are.